He won 2 Academy Awards, starred in some of the most influential films of the 20th century, and then walked away from Hollywood at the height of his fame to live quietly in the New Mexico desert. When Gene Hackman was found dead in his Santa Fe home in February 2025 at the age of 95, alongside his wife Betsy Arakoa, the story that unfolded over the following weeks was not a Hollywood script. It was something more human, more ordinary, and in its own way more tragic than any thriller he ever starred in. The story of an old man losing his memory, a devoted wife whose death he likely never even understood, and a series of medical facts that took investigators nearly 2 weeks to piece together. This is the real story of Gene Hackman, the actor who shaped modern American cinema, and the true, documented account of how his life came to an end. Eugene Allen Hackman was born on January 30th, 1930. In San Bernardino, California, and spent much of his early childhood in Danville, Illinois. His father worked at a local newspaper, operating a printing press, and by most accounts the household was not an easy one. His parents divorced when Hackman was still a boy, and he later described feeling like an outsider for much of his youth. At 16, he left home and lied about his age to join the United States Marine Corps, serving for several years before being discharged. He drifted for a while afterward, working odd jobs and studying journalism and television production, before deciding, almost on a whim in his mid-20s, to pursue acting. It was an unusual and late start for someone who would go on to become one of the most respected performers of his generation. Hackman enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse in California, where he famously was voted, along with his classmate and lifelong friend Dustin Hoffman, least likely to succeed by his fellow students. The two men, along with another aspiring actor named Robert Duvall, shared a tight friendship during those lean years in New York City, all 3 struggling for work and camping out in cheap apartments while they waited for their break. During that period, Hackman married his first wife, Faye Maltese, in 1956, and the couple had 3 children together before divorcing in 1986 after 3 decades of marriage. It was a long stretch of financial uncertainty for the young family, with Hackman taking whatever paying work he could find, from moving furniture to acting in television commercials, while continuing to chase stage and screen roles well into his 30s. Hackman's own break came slowly. He worked steadily in television and off-Broadway theater through the early 1960s, picking up small film roles until a performance as Buck Barrow, the good-natured brother Clyde in the 1967 landmark film Bonnie and Clyde, earned him his first Academy Award nomination. The film, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, was a defining moment for what became known as New Hollywood, and Hackman was suddenly, at 37 years old, a name that mattered. It was a remarkably late start compared to most leading men of his generation, and Hackman himself often spoke about how those years of struggle shaped the way he approached every role afterward, with kind of blue-collar discipline rather than movie star ease. The 1970s became the decade that cemented Hackman's legacy. In 1971, he starred as the obsessive, morally compromised narcotics detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle in William Friedkin's The French Connection, a gritty crime drama built around one of the most famous car chases ever filmed to the streets of Brooklyn. Hackman would later say he performed a significant portion of the driving himself, though the most dangerous shots were handled by stunt driver Bill Hickman. The role won Hackman the Academy Award for Best Actor, and the film swept the major categories of the Oscars, including Best Picture. 3 years later, he gave what many critics still consider the finest performance of his career, playing a paranoid surveillance expert consumed by guilt in Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, a quiet, unsettling film that arrived the same year as The Godfather Part II and helped define the anxious, post-Watergate mood of American cinema. Hackman moved fluidly between genres during this period, taking on the villainous, scheming Lex Luthor in 1978's Superman, a role that introduced him to an entirely new generation of moviegoers who knew nothing of Popeye Doyle. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Hackman kept working at a pace few actors could match, appearing in dozens of films across nearly every genre. He earned another Best Actor nomination for his role as an FBI agent investigating the murders of civil rights workers in the American South in 1988's Mississippi Burning. He showed off a gift for comedy as the basketball coach in Hoosiers, and later as a fading gangster trying to break into movie business in Get Shorty. In 1992, he took on a role that would win him his second Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actor. Little Bill Daggett, the brutal, self-righteous sheriff in Clint Eastwood's revisionist Western Unforgiven. Eastwood, who directed and starred in the film, later said he needed Hackman specifically because of his rare ability to make an unsympathetic character feel human. Unforgiven won the Academy Award for Best Picture and is still regarded as one of the great American Westerns. Hackman closed out his career with one more indelible performance, playing the estranged, eccentric patriarch Royal Tenenbaum in Wes Anderson's 2001 film The Royal Tenenbaums. It was, by his own admission, a difficult shoot. Hackman had a reputation for being demanding and occasionally short-tempered on set, and reports at the time suggested friction between him and the young director. But the performance became one of the most beloved of his later career, earning him a Golden Globe for Best Actor. Across his career, Hackman amassed 2 Academy Awards for Golden Globes, a Screen Actors Guild Award, and 2 British Academy Film Awards, appearing in more than 80 films over roughly 5 decades. In 2004, following the release of Welcome to Mooseport, Hackman quietly retired from acting. He gave few explanations at the time beyond saying he no longer had the same drive for the work, and he largely avoided public life afterward, settling into his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with his second wife, Betsy Arakawa. Arakawa was a classical pianist, decades younger than Hackman, whom he had met in the 1980s at a Los Angeles gym where she worked part-time while pursuing her music career. They married in 1991 and remained together for more than 3 decades, largely out of the public eye, in a home they built together in the hills outside Santa Fe. By most accounts from neighbors and the small circle of people who knew them, theirs was a quiet, private life built around music, art, and Hackman's later-in-life passions, including painting and writing novels. Hackman published several works of historical fiction in his retirement, sometimes with a co-writer, drawing on his interest in naval history and the American West, a pursuit that seemed to bring him genuine satisfaction after decades in front of the camera. Friends and former colleagues described a man who had made a deliberate, almost total break from the entertainment industry, rarely giving interviews and declining most opportunities to return to acting even when offered significant roles. He and Arakawa traveled, attended local arts events in Santa Fe, and by the account of neighbors kept largely to themselves, a stark contrast to the very public decades Hackman had spent as one of the most recognizable faces in American film. As Hackman aged into his 90s, his health became a growing concern to those close to him, though it was rarely discussed publicly. He had already survived multiple cardiac procedures over the years, including bypass surgery, and reports following his death indicated he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at some point in the years before he died, a diagnosis the family had kept private. Arakawa, more than 3 decades younger than her husband, had increasingly taken a role of his primary caretaker, managing the household and, according to people familiar with their routine, much of his day-to-day care as his memory declined. That dynamic would become directly relevant to how investigators eventually pieced together the final days of both of their lives. On February 26, 2025, maintenance workers visiting the property in the Hyde Park area outside Santa Fe discovered the bodies of Hackman, Arakawa, and one of their 3 dogs. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office described the scene as suspicious enough to warrant a full investigation, and in the days that followed, before any official findings were released, speculation online moved quickly toward alarming theories, including the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning, given that an open prescription bottle and scattered pills were found near Arakawa's body. Investigators tested the home for gas leaks. The New Mexico Gas Company later confirmed that a minor leak had been found in the stove burner, but investigators in the fire department determined it had not released nearly enough carbon monoxide to be fatal, and toxicology testing for carbon monoxide poisoning on both bodies came back negative. Nearly 2 weeks after the couple was found, New Mexico's chief medical examiner, Dr. Heather Jarrell, held a news conference to share the actual findings from the autopsies, findings she noted were unusual to make public in such detail, since death investigations are not typically discussed openly. According to Dr. Jarrell, Betsy Arakawa died first, likely on or around February 11th, from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare and severe respiratory illness caused by exposure to the urine, droppings, or saliva of infected rodents, particularly deer mice, which are common throughout the New Mexico high desert. Hantavirus infections are uncommon, but serious. State health officials noted that New Mexico has recorded roughly 136 cases over the previous 50 years, with fatality rate close to 40% for the regional strain. Investigators believe Arakawa had been active and visibly healthy in the days beforehand, seen on surveillance footage shopping and running errands in town, before her symptoms escalated rapidly, as hantavirus infections often do, moving from flu-like symptoms to severe respiratory failure within a short window. Hackman, the medical examiner concluded, died separately and of unrelated causes roughly a week after his wife, likely around February 18th, based on a last recorded activity from his pacemaker. His official cause of death was listed as hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, meaning severe long-term heart disease, with Alzheimer's disease listed as a significant contributing factor. The autopsy showed Hackman had a history of multiple heart surgeries and prior heart attacks, along with kidney changes consistent with long-term high blood pressure. Examination of his brain confirmed advanced Alzheimer's disease, Dr. Gerald noted, publicly that given the severity of his cognitive decline, it was quite possible that Hackman was never fully aware his wife had died and may have continued living the home for days without understanding what had happened around him. Neither body showed any sign of trauma, and there was no indication of foul play at any point in the investigation. The circumstances were undeniably heartbreaking rather than mysterious once the full picture came into focus. A woman in otherwise good health contracted a rare, fast-moving illness that public health officials say is genuinely difficult to detect in its early stages. Since it initially resembles a common flu, her husband, in the advanced stages of a disease that had already begun eroding his memory and understanding of the world around him, was left alone at home and died of the same heart condition that had already required multiple surgeries over the years. The dog that died was believed to have perished after being trapped without access to food or water once its owners could no longer care for it, while 2 other dogs were found alive on the property. Sheriff Adon Mendoza said investigators reviewed extensive surveillance footage from the property as part of their routine work, which helped establish the timeline of Arakawa's final days, and found nothing to suggest anyone else had been involved. In the aftermath, tributes poured in from across the film industry, directors and actors who had worked with Hackman, including longtime collaborators and friends going back to his earliest days in New York, spoke about his generosity as a scene partner and his relentless work ethic, even as his public reputation had also included stories of his sharp temper on set in his younger years. Hackman's family released a statement describing him as a beloved father and grandfather whose acting career, however celebrated, was secondary in their eyes to the man he was at home. Film historians and critics use the occasion to revisit his body of work, much of which had quietly become foundational to how American movies portray morally complicated men, from Popeye Doyle's obsessive pursuit of justice to Royal Tenenbaum's late, fumbling attempt at redemption. What stands out most, looking back at the reporting from those first chaotic days compared to clear medical findings that eventually emerged, is how ordinary and preventable-seeming tragedy can look extraordinary from a distance, simply because the people involved were famous and the initial details were incomplete. There was no scandal, no cover-up, and no unresolved question once toxicology and autopsy results came back. There was a 95-year-old man in declining health, his wife for more than 3 decades, a home in a beautiful but remote part of the American Southwest, and 2 unrelated medical conditions that happened to strike within the same short window of time. Health officials used the moment to remind the public of the real risks that hantavirus poses in the region, particularly for anyone in homes near open desert or fields where deer mice are common, urging basic precautions like sealing entry points and ventilating enclosed spaces before cleaning them. Gene Hackman's career will be remembered for the roles that reshaped what a leading man could look like on screen. Not conventionally handsome, not naturally charming, but relentlessly compelling, capable of making audiences sympathize with detectives, villains, coaches, and broken fathers alike. He worked with some of the most significant directors of his era, from Friedkin and Coppola to Eastwood and Anderson, and he did so across 5 decades without ever losing the intensity that first got him noticed in Bonnie and Clyde. His final years, spent largely out of the spotlight in New Mexico, reflected a man who seemed content to leave the performing behind and simply live, paint right, and grow old with his wife. That the end of that life turned out to be so quiet, so medically explainable, and so devoid of any real mystery is in its own way, a fitting final chapter for a man who spent his career making audiences believe in complicated, human, unglamorous truths.